Hey, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm here today with James Dolezal, who is a professor of theology at Cairn University and the author of God Without Parts, which is a very important work on divine simplicity. Now, James and I met at the Center for Classical Theism this fall, which is held just before the Evangelical Theological Society. And we had some great conversations. And I said, hey, do you mind if we continue some of those? Because I get questions about divine simplicity, and I'm a classical theist, and one reason for that is I hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and it lays this doctrine out pretty clearly. And I thought I would just start there, if that's all right, James, with the doctrine of God. Why does the doctrine of God matter? That seems obvious, but it actually
Yeah.
comes up quite often.
Well, I mean, maybe very simply, to ensure, I mean, if man is a religious animal, a case could be made for that, I suppose. He's at heart a worshiper. He will serve and adore something. The question is what you're worshiping actually God? And then maybe deeper then really the question is it actually worthy of that ultimate worship and adoration you give to it? Or put a little differently, from a Christian standpoint, how do I know that what I'm worshiping is God and not an idol?
Yeah, that's
That
really
should
good.
and that should be just be a question that really animates us. I think Paul says in Galatians 4 that before we knew Christ, we were enslaved to those, in his language, those things which are not by nature gods. And he kind of gets into the whole phusis nature language. And I think maybe one extrapolation from that is then there is one who is God by nature. And if we're going to be able to sort of test the false gods, we're going to need to be able to say something true about the God who is, as sort of our benchmark. So that's
Yeah, I
one
like
reason.
that. The idle part, in terms of our own vain imaginations, we've made something up in our mind, call it our God, worship it and adore it, as you said, but maybe it's just pretend. Maybe it's not real.
Yeah, or you're an Orthodox Christian and then you lapse. I think of John in Revelation 19 and then Revelation 22, where he's in such wonder at the angel who's giving him this apocalyptic tour that he falls down to worship at the feet of an angel. This is John, an
Yeah.
apostle who was with Christ, and yet late in his career, he's giving worship to an unworthy object. Now, thankfully, that holy angel rebukes him and says, "Don't worship God.
Yeah.
Don't worship me." I guess it kind of came home to me some years ago. If a mature apostle can have a momentary lapse in the proper object of his worship, how dare I think that I'm immune to that myself?
Yeah.
And just kind of put me to thinking.
What I really like that, and I like how you began by saying we're going to worship or adore something, and so someone, because I can imagine an atheist saying, "Well, I don't believe in God at all," but if we look into an atheist life, we'll see that they worship and adore something. It might just be themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we in his Christian phase, Bob Dylan has a song, and he's, you're going to serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, and there's something to that. I think we need to test that and say, is this really the Lord, the God of all creation, the
Yeah.
one from whom and through whom and to whom are all things that I'm actually worshiping? And then maybe like a little bit downstream of that, uh, granting that all Christians certainly intend to worship that, a little downstream of that, I want to say, is my God talk or are my God thoughts in conformity with what God must be to be God? So something like that.
Yeah, that's good. And I wonder, that kind of gets us into this reality. I mentioned atheist, but then among the people who say they believe in God, you'll have quite a different differences come up. I mean, a number of differences, right? So someone could say, I believe in God, but they really mean, they might say, God used to be one of us. And if you live the right way, you can become God.
Right.
And so there's different views of what God means. I think there's two real competing ones right now that come up in this question of divine simplicity. And it seems to revolve. I mean, it might be wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to revolve especially around God's knowledge of the future and free actions. For a lot of people, that's where they get involved in this discussion. So they'll say, to be free, I can't be caused by anything. But if God knows the future, then I'm predetermined. And so God must be learning the future with us. So that seems to be one view of the doctrine of God. And that's very opposing to divine simplicity.
Absolutely. I mean, at a certain point, divine, if you pull that thread, I mean, you can pull that thread and it can go in a lot of different directions in terms of the conversation. You could, I think one plausible place that Christians, sort of Bible believing, maybe I'll just say historically Orthodox Christians or broadly Augustinian, and then that's a big net, where they tend to go in response immediately and understandably is to Bible verses that will indicate that God not just knows the end from the beginning, but actually declares it
Yeah.
and brings about all things in accordance with his counsel. And then then there are a whole bunch of sort of stock verses that are just going to bear that out
Mhm.
explicitly. And I think that's I think for Bible believing Christians, that's a really good, I mean, that's exactly, your instinct should take you right there to those verses. But there are also, if I can put it this way, there are also other resources in store to help you defend God's preeminence in terms of knowledge and will, if you take that kind of Augustinian approach. And if you dig down that route, you eventually will come to the doctrine of divine simplicity, where if his knowledge is in any way determined or caused by the object of his knowledge, like free acts of humans or angels, for instance,
Mhm.
then you're going to have to affirm a metaphysical structure that makes that possible, namely, and now I will just, now I'll go right to the deep end and say the composition of principles of act and passive potency. It doesn't seem that there's any metaphysical alternative to that broad characterization if that's how God knows things.
Yeah.
Then you can kind of step back and say, all right, I'm committed to a God composed of active passive potency. Could that possibly be the creator of all things, the one from whom and through whom and to whom are all things? And the classical theists will say it couldn't be. That can't be the way it is. So that, I mean,
Explain
yeah,
briefly
if you
explain
go
that
that
for us.
route,
Why not?
say again.
Briefly explain why not. Why are the classical theists to say that it can't be?
Yeah, well, I'll just take Paul's statement, Romans 11:36, as kind of a springboard. Um, when he says all things are from him, through him, and to him, if God were composed of parts, whether various physical bits or metaphysical bits, for form and prime matter or something like that, then you would actually be discovering principles of God's being more fundamental in reality than himself, so that the first being and the one from whom are all things would not actually be God. God would be a little bit down the line from the principles that caused him. And when I say down the line, I don't mean necessarily temporally. We can just sideline that
Logically, yeah.
question for a second. I'm talking in terms of not only broad logical necessitation derivation, but also metaphysical derivation, even if co-eternal, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if he's composed of principles of act and principles of passive potency, which, like, form is act, prime matter is passive potency.
Mhm.
A substance is in passive potency formally to accidents. Accidents are in passive potency existentially to the existence of substances. This kind of, I mean, so you could plug in the act potency composition to all sorts of different, sort of more specific compositions.
Mhm.
But in every one of those instances, you're actually identifying real principles of being in God that have to be, in so much as they are principles of being, parts more fundamental than the whole. And then you're left with a kind of weird scenario where you're actually saying there's something more basic in reality than God, in virtue of which God is God. And I think Christians, and Owen, I'd say most Christians, even if they can't articulate it this way and they don't have
Yeah.
a substance metaphysics vocabulary and conceptual world to help them, they're just instinctively committed to the absolute primacy and irreducibility of God.
Yeah.
They just are. And I think the reason divine simplicity hangs around, despite the analytic theology critics and others that despise it so much, despite all that, the reason it hangs around is because it, strange as it is, and I don't mind saying it's strange, I mean that reverentially, but strange as it is, it still seems to concur with an instinct that is so deeply Christian, which is nothing not God makes God be God.
Yeah. That's great.
And if he's not simple, that just couldn't be true.
Yeah.
I think that's why it hangs around.
Well, and when you say strange in our day, I understand what you mean, because it's contrary to certain intuitions that are very important to evangelicals, broadly speaking. So broadly speaking, evangelicals tend to be Arminians, and the ones that are trained today have really adopted Molinism as their solution, which is the Jesuit solution to the problem of evil and free will. But it aligns better, they think, with Arminian instincts. And so in that, you run into some of the problems you were just bringing up, which is God is looking ahead at the possible outcomes and selecting the one that he thinks is the best, where people choose him over people who don't choose him. And so because of those commitments, when they hear about divine simplicity, they can say, wow, that just doesn't make sense to me.
So I think you're right. That is a good description of kind of modern, broad Arminian evangelicalism. I wonder if historically, if you read Jacob Arminius on this question, though, he will pretty much give you the Augustinian
I know, that's
Thomistic
what's funny.
line, which is kind of funny. And so I this is at least how I read it when I'm reading Arminius on human free will. It seems like God is in some kind of dependency relationship as he himself discovers your acts of free will. Whereas if you just go into his theology proper and kind of
Yeah.
leave off his theological anthropology, it's kind of a nice vanilla classical theism.
Yep.
And I like in my mind that's a insurmountable tension in his theology.
Yeah.
But like all now I'm talking about Arminius, not modern Arminians. But
Sure.
in Arminius's theology, I think that was an insurmountable tension that should have been resolved in one
Mhm.
direction. But still, I would say, even still, his deep instincts wanted to say
Yeah.
there's nothing more fundamental or more absolute than God. And I've got
Yep.
to say simplicity to maintain that. Even he
Yeah.
would have said that.
I think so. I mean, when I talk to Molinists, they'll say the same thing. So about God, I mean,
Yeah.
but they have this instinct that they have to have a certain kind of libertarian free will. And this is the best explanation of how that works in. But when you point these things out, they'll say, no, no, God's sovereign, God's uh, fundamental. So I do think there's a tension, but I wonder if that's kind of how they get to a place where when they hear about divine simplicity, it sounds odd. And so I wanted just to start with this idea of the doctrine of God, because you kind of get these two very different views of God. And it came out, I think, at the ETS this year, where you have something. I don't know if they'll say they're open theists, but they'll talk about God as learning or growing or finding out things as we go. He might know everything that's currently knowable, but
A
there's
sub
more things
a
to
real
be.
grand subject of experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's more things to be known. And the ETS, I mean, when I first started, my very first year going to the ETS as a graduate student, I think it was 2000 or 99, probably 2000 or 2001. They were having discussions about open theism. Clark Pinnock was there, and he was one of the people. They were looking through his theology and trying to decide, is this consistent with our doctrinal statement. So it's interesting to me, kind of my whole career from graduate student to the present, the ETS is really struggling with the doctrine of God.
I sort of came of age as a young man in that exact context, mid late 90s into the early 2000s. The big doctrine of God war was over open theism, and it was kind of it was a reductionistic debate. It was basically, does God have exhaustive foreknowledge? That was more or less the pinpoint of contention. And obviously there were those on the one side, John Frame and Bruce Ware among the Presbyterian and Baptist Calvinistic evangelicals, who said, yes, of course he does. And he does because he declares or
That's
decrees
important.
all things.
You brought that up earlier. I just want to emphasize that for everyone watching, the difference between knowing because you read ahead in the book, so to speak, versus knowing because you determined it to be the case.
Yeah. And so theirs was not just a sort of mere prescience, but it was a, it was a prescience due to the decree.
Yep.
He knows the future because he's decreed the future, not because he like got a an advanced copy
Exactly. Yeah.
sneak peek. And to their credit, and I'm in some of my writing, I've been critical of the solutions of Frame and Ware, but I'm certainly not critical of them on this point that they were contending for, 25 years ago. And rightly so, that God knows the future because God decrees the future, and I think that bears that's you get a kind of broad Augustinian Thomistic,
Mm.
Calvinistic, if you will, background to that supports them, and they stand in good company holding that view with lots of convincing exegesis, in my view.
Mhm.
I think where the challenge came, and as I remember, that's sort of where the skirmish kind of came to, was God's in control of the present circumstances, but that doesn't, and he can make really good educated guesses about what's next better than anybody, better than any scientist. He can kind of predict the future with a high level of reliability. And then in the event that free creatures sort of pull a surprise, he also has just a wealth of resources and swiftness to quickly fix it.
Yeah.
And that was one solution. And it still felt like a big God, but it really was a relatively big God, not an absolutely
Exactly.
big
Yeah.
God.
Not absolute, not infinite.
So that was that side. And then the other side, obviously I've mentioned, didn't want that. I think where the challenge came, Owen, was just in saying, why? So I think the solution on the one side, though, was God's in control of all things because God determines all things. And a lot of conservative Christians and the sort of the young restless reform types back in those days signed off on all of that, and I think they weren't wrong for doing it. But concessions were made to the open theists at the metaphysical level, in which God really was, even by those Calvinistic evangelicals, really was reconceived and represented as someone who receives certain states of mind and emotion from the creature's action upon him.
Mhm.
And for Bruce Ware, and I've pointed his work out, but for Bruce Ware, that was the subject of his 1984 doctoral dissertation at Fuller Theological Seminary. I mean, that was his thesis, that we need to revise immutability
Mm.
and kind of reimagine it as God in control of his experiences, but not God as totally immutable in essence, but mutable in these other relational ways, which is basically to say, and this is what I have pointed out with that, the only way that works is if God is composed of substance and accidents.
Mhm.
And you have to explode divine simplicity to pull off that explanatory model.
Yeah.
And in a certain way, that puts him in league with the theistic ontology of the open theist. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly how they think God is structured as well. They all believe in a multi-parted God.
Yep.
And I think that was just in like getting down the road from those debates that you're talking about within ETS back in those days. It seems that, like, while I certainly lean toward one side over the other in how the debate went down, it seems peculiar to me
Yeah.
that at some fundamental metaphysical level, they actually both hold to a kind of process theism.
That's really good. Yeah. That's goodness. I think you're right. And I think, for me, the solution would be, hey, on that point, is departing from the reform standards.
Yeah, I mean, especially for someone like a Presbyterian who has obligations to an historical document like the Westminster Confession of Faith. You have a statement, Confession 2:1, the Lord our God is without parts.
Mhm.
And then we also have a 16th and 17th century Reformed context that actually helps us understand at the metaphysical level what was involved in that statement. So we can actually reconstruct the authorial intent.
Yeah.
And I would say someone like John Frame, in the way he construes God's relationship to the world, could not possibly sync up with the authorial intent of the Westminster Confession.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and let's get to that. So that was the kind of the first part I want to talk about was doctrine of God. Second part, let's just get into what is divine simplicity then. And from the confessions uh standpoint, 2.1, you mentioned it without parts. What does that
Yeah,
mean
so this
exactly?
is in the I think the Belgic Confession says God is simple. They say it with that older language, but what we mean is without parts. And so I think at a most fundamental level, if this is a negative doctrine, this is a bit of apophaticism, if you want the fancy word for it. This is a negation of something. We're negating parts. There's a positive corollary, I should say right now, which is pure actuality, but that's pretty exotic stuff and can be brought up. But I think to start with, when we say without parts, it's like any negation that we make, Owen. If we're going to say God isn't, XYZ, then we're going to have some modest and true conception of what X, Y, and Z are, so that the denial of them to God is actually theologically meaningful to us. And I think with regard to parts, in particular parts, there is such a in the sort of post scientific revolution age, or let us put it, once metaphysics was buried and the last rites were pronounced, and it was basically an arcane relic of a pre-enlightenment age, and now we're into physics, and physics is king. Parts basically get reduced to material bits.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah, and you
basically it.
might get that because the preceding word is without body
Yeah, and
or
I'll,
parts.
I'll only say, and I'm just gonna strive here at the
Mhm.
grammar. That comma was there in the original. If you, I don't know how you read that. The first time I read that, God was without body parts. I
Yeah,
thought,
right, right,
yeah, he
yeah.
doesn't have a body. He doesn't have body parts. Well,
Yeah,
of course, if he's without parts, that would include body parts. But there's a comma actually there between
yeah.
body and
Those are
parts.
separate things as emphasis, but it's also
Right.
we think of body in a really materialistic way, reductionistic way too.
That's true.
Versus just the idea of being a compound. A body is a compound of different things.
Absolutely. And there's a bit of this and a bit of that, and they're not the same bit. And
Yep.
there's got to be some accounting of their togetherness, and therefore the body itself is reducible to something that is not the body.
Mhm.
Ergo, the body could never be the first and absolute being. You could reason like that just about the
Yep.
body,
Yep.
and come to the conclusion the first cause of all things could not be a body,
Yep.
just based on that reasoning right there.
Yep.
I mean, even before you read, Luke 24,
Yeah.
when Jesus says the spirit doesn't have a body like I have. Even before
Exactly.
you get into those texts, you could just reason that the first
Well,
cause
that
of being
and
couldn't have a
earlier,
body.
that's exactly what was said. God is the most pure spirit.
Yes, that's right. That's
And in
right. And this
question
is an
4 of the
implication of
shorter
it.
catechism, it starts, what is God? God's a spirit.
Hey, just a quick thing on that, because since you said he's a most pure spirit, it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting. It does. I'm not. This is totally parenthetical, Owen,
Yeah.
but it does raise the question if whether the Westminster Divines were conceiving of uh, less pure spirits.
Yeah.
That is to say, pure spirits, but not most pure.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to throw out there, yes, that's definitely how they thought of angels. They thought of
Yeah.
angels as pure created spirits, but not most pure, because they were
Mhm.
still composed of
Yep.
certain metaphysical couplets.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for example, they're finite. They grow in the sense of increasing in knowledge. They don't know
Right.
everything. So
Their
yeah.
will can change. They can go
Yep.
from good to bad,
Yep.
in the case of fallen angels, and they're most fundamentally composed of essence and existence.
Mhm. Yep.
But yet they're pure, and they're purer than we are, in as much as they're not composed of form and matter. So they're pure created spirits, just not most pure. And I think that's it's. I
Yeah.
think that's why the confession puts that superlative in there.
Yeah, it's in there, but it's all it also it heads off certain problems of having a physical god, and one that if someone says, well, no one really thinks that anymore, Zeus and Jupiter are long gone. Well, I mean, we have Mormonism still, and Joseph Smith and Brigham Young are both very clear. God has a body just like us, and has
Yeah.
babies with his wife, and then they go on to have become gods themselves. So people still think that God has a body in physical sense.
Um, I think that second word there, parts, certainly though, as you were pointing, I think saying, it really actually envisions a much broader
Yeah,
consideration than just immateriality.
yeah,
And so if you're going to say God's without parts, I mean, one thing you would need to do early on, just to make that negation meaningful, is say, what is a part?
hmm,
And then, let's be a little Socratic here. If I say, well, a part is a hand, or a part is a a bit of cartilage, or a
hmm,
part is a lug nut, in a
yeah,
on a car, or a carburetor. Socrates would have pointed out to me, you haven't said what a part is. You've just named certain particular parts.
yeah.
And so I think we have to drill down deeper. We have to say not what counts as a part. Before we say what counts as a part, we need to get down to the partness of a part. What actually constitutes a part a part?
Yeah, so
Um,
giving a connotative definition rather than a denotative definition.
yeah, exactly. Getting at the whatness of the thing, not just a particular instantiation of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, and there's a whole science for this, and it's for, for real pointy headed philosophy students. They can get into the science of mereology, which is
Yeah.
a subsection of philosophy. But you can kind of give a garden variety answer. I've offered something like this, that a part is anything in an entity that is less than the whole, and without which the whole would be really different than it is.
Mhm.
And then I would contend that you could actually, that's pretty vanilla stuff, but it's generic enough that I think you could plug that into any instance of parts, physical or metaphysical, and I think it would fit.
I think so, and maybe it helps even with an objection that comes up sometimes to what most people take to be common sense, which is the whole is greater than the parts. And set
Yeah.
theorists will say, "Nah, I have an infinite part, and that part, that infinite whole, I mean, has infinite parts." But I think your definition could help us with that in terms of how it will be dramatically different without those parts.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, my guess is that what's happening with a set theorist is that they're this will sound odd, but I think this is doable. They're using infinite there in a somewhat truncated sense. They're not
Yeah, I
using
think you're right.
infinite there in the existential sense of the term. They're probably using it with regard to some kind of formal infiniteness, which this is strange, but even Thomas Aquinas will, with some qualification, attribute relative infiniteness to angels,
Hmm.
given that there's no material part in their essence contracting their form. Their forms are thereby, to that extent, relatively infinite. And
Hmm.
so then you could even talk about things that are infinite but aren't God, or
Yeah,
created infinites. But they can't be created infinites in the proper and deepest
yeah,
existential sense.
yeah. That's
But
right.
you could have a kind of relative infinity, and I suspect that when you have set theorists talking like that,
That's what
that
it is.
they
Yeah,
don't mean infinite in the I am that I am sense. They
right.
mean it in some kind of more restricted formal sense.
Yeah. Well, and almost more like inexhaustible.
Yeah,
You can start counting right now and keep going forever with real numbers and also with integers,
right.
even though one small supposedly would be in some sense smaller, but not really because they're both inexhaustible.
Yeah.
Um,
And then you could ask about the status of the existence of this endless set, and then where
yeah,
does it actually exist and
yeah,
like that.
yeah. So, what are some different versions of divine simplicity? So, God doesn't have parts; He's not made up of something metaphysically or logically prior that builds into God, and
Right.
that could be qualities or it could be it's not material things. We'll rule that out since we're theists. But what are some other versions of this? Because I think one way when I read some of the debates that come up, it's usually mistakes or maybe not clearly articulated positions lead to the other side. They latch onto that and they say, "Oh, see, here's a big problem." And so, for example, some critics of divine simplicity will say, "Well, that's ridiculous because the divine simplicity theologian says that goodness is justice, violation of law of identity. Those are clearly two different things. So, what's happening there? Why is that coming up? Why are they thinking that's what the divine simplicity says?"
Yeah, that's I mean, that is a frequent critique of a certain version of divine simplicity, one that I think is the most plausible, one that's offered by I think implicitly by, well, almost explicitly by Augustine, but really developed and worked out in fine-tuned fashion by Aquinas, and then really picked up by a lot of Protestants after Aquinas, which is sometimes called the identity thesis, that in God, goodness is wisdom, is justice, is life, is power. And then and then someone thinks to themselves, yeah, but that couldn't be, because then the fact that I use different terms and the fact that those different terms actually have different meanings, wouldn't that correspond to the fact that those are actually different realities in God? So I make a conceptual distinction between wisdom and power. Doesn't my conceptual distinction betoken a real distinction metaphysically? And I think that's the assumption sometimes that's working there, which is, if there can be a conceptual distinction in my mind, that must always correspond to a real distinction in the thing. I think that's just a philosophical mistake. I mean, leaving the theological debate to the side for the moment, I think that's just a philosophical error. To think that you can ground real distinctions based upon
Yeah.
conceptual distinctions.
But does it mean then that there are in God's being contradictions?
No, because the thing is, everything that we mean formally by good, wise, loving, just, true, and eternal, God is. But what grounds that, what grounds the truth of those predicates in God is not a bit of wisdom, bit of love, bit of justice, bit of eternity, all really distinct from each other, but wonderfully cobbled together in a composite we call God. What I want to say is actually God just is to be God and to be wise, to be God and to be just, to be God and be loving, or that's just God being God, and that
Yeah.
there's not something more fundamental, principially more fundamental than God that's in him, thereby constituting him such. Otherwise, God would be dependent on what is not himself to be himself.
Yeah.
But I think it's not contradictory in the sense of everything that I mean by those terms conceptually is in God. The way that I conceive those terms distinctly is not in God.
Yeah.
In other words, there's not a real, and does that mean, so then the question is, well, do I need a real distinction of properties in a thing always necessarily to ground the conceptual distinction about that thing that I have in my mind?
Mhm.
And I think you could just make a philosophical case that it's not necessary. You
Yeah.
could say something like, you could refer to the morning and the evening star. And
Hesperus and
morning and
phosphorus.
was that?
Hesperus is phosphorus.
Yeah. You could say morning star and evening star, and the referent would be identical in terms of the thing, Venus, but morning and evening wouldn't have to be conceptually collapsed into each other and be absolutely identical. Venus is identical with Venus, and I call Venus morning star and evening star. And morning and evening are conceptually distinct in my mind, but it doesn't mean that there's something in Venus that's morningness and something else beside that that's eveningness, thereby constituting Venus morning and evening star. That doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, and I always
That's just an
I
easy
think
example,
I
but
think so, and for me it always is a troubling critique because it seems to wiggle the toe over the line of divine aseity. And what I mean is, when we start to get into questions like what is it like to be God in himself versus how has God revealed himself to us, we might be, or maybe we are, crossing a line into an area where we really couldn't know. We only know God as he's revealed himself to us. And so to say, what's it like in God could be crossing that line.
yeah, and this is actually the importance of the apophaticism here of the negation. When I'm saying God is simple, or even when I'm positively saying God is pure act, I would hasten to add that I can't imagine either of those things. First of all, you can't imagine
Right.
anything that
Good
isn't
point.
material.
Yep.
But I can't imagine those things, nor can I comprehend those things. I could give you 1,001 reasons why I think they're true
Right.
and why the alternative would be absurd. But that's a long shot from saying, and therefore I have an isomorphic one-to-one conception of it in my
Yeah.
mind.
Well, I think that's exactly right because that's a lot of times I'll find people doing that when I'm discussing this or the dual nature of Christ or the Trinity. And they'll say, "Well, I can't imagine what it'd be like to be both God and man." It's like, yeah, you can't. That's right. The,
That's
the,
right.
the
And that's
truth of the
okay.
doctrine doesn't rely on you being able to figure out what it'd be like.
Aquinas critiques the pre-Socratic philosophers in part because they made imagination the measure of the real.
Well, yeah, but that's what you see. I was trained in my PhD in analytic philosophy, and that's like the go-to method.
Yeah.
Imagine, and you make up an example, right? But
This is, I mean, this is why I'm a moderate realist, I guess. But
yeah,
yeah,
well, and I've also thought. I mean, the way the Westminster Shorter Catechism question 4 defines God as God's a spirit. I think there's three parts to it. What kind of substance? God's a spirit, and then the incommunicable attributes, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, and then the moral attributes and things like goodness, uh, love, wisdom, etc. So it seems like that definition of God, why I like it so much, is it's written in a way that logically holds together. It isn't that God could be a spirit infinite but not eternal, or
right,
a spirit infinite eternal but not unchanging, or that God could be infinite eternal unchanging but not in justice, only in goodness. So another aspect I think of the divine simplicity argument is that those all hang together. Once you know that God's all knowing or all powerful, he also must be all knowing. It follows, and must be all good. That follows. And so sometimes I think some of the critiques come from a place of not understanding how those doctrines come together and thinking maybe God knows everything and he's all powerful, but he's evil, and not seeing why that would involve a contradiction.
right. No, I agree. I mean, there's a I would want like I think entailment reasoning can be tricky. I would want to be careful. Like I think there are certain higher principles, then certain things extrapolate from them. But you mentioned aseity, and I think this is really absolutely fundamental to this, which is if God is of himself, or if God is the reason for God, then if you dig down and find causal explanatory principles like parts, bits, even metaphysical ones, then you're going to really lose that primacy instantly, really. And then what do you put in its place? And this is a concern I have with recent evangelical, even conservative evangelical theology, is once you lose that metaphysical primacy, and yet you still want primacy, then you in a certain sense you make up your losses with like endless endless doses of sovereignty.
Yeah.
So I appeal to sovereignty as kind of the elixir that will cure the ailment of the fact that I now have a composite deity.
Yeah.
And I think Calvinists especially have to watch out for this, because
Yep.
Calvinists are usually, I mean, we're suckers for sovereignty because we see
Mhm.
it all over the Bible. But then sometimes sovereignty can be invoked to cover a theological sin, not a
Yeah.
moral one, but a theological sin, and then it's an unwarranted or illicit use of
Yeah,
sovereignty.
that's right. And I think that the early Greek philosophers were trying to figure out what element explains the world: water, fire, earth, air. And so there was also this search for the fifth element, the quintessence. And I think that that illustrates something that always happens in this doctrine of God discussion, which is if you think God is made up of elements, you're still going to end up describing something that's the quintessence, this fifth element, which is not itself made up of other things. And,
Yeah.
and so there's always that search. And so as soon as you say God isn't that, you're making something else that. And that's the problem I think you're identifying.
Yeah, and this is, I guess you could even go to the apeiron, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The
exactly.
boundless. And there's something even in the pre-Socratic instinct. Now they're still materialistic, so there's the problem. But even with all the blindness and darkness of their materialism, this some of them were nudging into the boundless as the ground of all being, because the bounded just couldn't be.
Well, exactly. Yep.
But multi-partedness is exactly boundedness.
Yeah.
It requires a this and a that really distinct from each other, thereby delimiting each other in the thing. It requires fundamentally boundedness.
Yep. And so you're talking about Calvinism and our interest in sovereignty, and then the aseity of God, though, because one of the important doctrines that you'll see Reformed theologians, whether it's Calvin down to Hodge, starting their theologies with is that God is only knowable as he reveals himself to us. And so a critique of divine simplicity is, wait a minute, we've got a theology professor here, we've got a philosophy professor here, and you guys have just been talking in a way that most Christians would not understand. Most Christians just have their Bible, and the Bible seems to clearly teach that God changes his mind, comes to learn new things. And that's what Christians need. They don't need all of this philosophy. You guys are doing the God of the philosophers, and Christians just need the God of the Bible. I think that's a very common objection. Give us your response.
Well, I would want to be, well, I mean, you know who I am and what I do. I mean, I obviously don't accept it, but
Yeah.
I also appreciate it on this level, and I mean it sincerely, that I think if classical theism makes you unable to speak in biblical idiom, then it has an unwarranted function in your God talk. At the same time, so I want to be able to say God was grieved in his heart, but I also want to be able to offer, a 15-second clarification and say that that's an anthropopathism, and here's what that word means, and let's get back to the sermon, that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
I don't think that it should become this, where the classical theist pastor who's getting triggered by every anthropomorphic, anthropopathic text that he comes across in scripture is going to be a really bad preacher.
Mhm.
And obviously God intends people to hear it to hear his revelation packaged under the, he reveals the infinite under the form of the finite. He reveals the immutable under the form of the mutable. He
Yeah.
reveals the impassible under the form of the passible. So I want to say that. At the same time, though, I do think that we have a responsibility just like we would with body parts or functions. Then when it talks about God separating the waters of the Red Sea by blasting them with his nostrils, and it looks like a great big nose blow,
Hmm.
parting the Red Sea. If you had people in your congregation or in your classroom that believed that God really did have a giant nose that
Yeah.
blew so hard that it separated waters from the sea because his nose is so like big and powerful,
Yeah.
then you would owe them some. You would actually, you wouldn't even have to go to the philosophical theology stuff. Actually, you could just leave that to the side for a moment and go to other texts of scripture that make that
Yeah.
interpretation problematic. So you could do an
Yeah.
intratextual critique of
Or
that
that
over.
God has a right hand and Jesus is standing next to a right hand.
Right. Yeah. And then you can ask the question, if God is a spirit and a spirit doesn't have a body, then how could God have medial and distal parts?
Yeah. Yeah. I think
But
that,
then why, and then we should say, but why does the Bible talk like that?
yeah.
There has to be truth and meaning in that revelation without the truth and meaning being irreducibly in the isomorphic literal interpretation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, I think that's right. In one aspect of that is that God is communicating to us as we understand things and elevating our thoughts higher than that. But I do think that there's two other things I bring up I like to run by you. One is when it says something like God, is angry at sin, the idea seems to be in people's minds that he wasn't angry before, and now he is angry, and later on he won't be angry anymore. But if we add in what he's angry about, sin, I think we can say that God is eternally hateful of sin. He doesn't change.
Yeah.
He doesn't become hangry at some point when he really gets fed up, like maybe like a parent getting exasperated and blowing their top. That's not what's happening at all. God's always angry at sin
Yeah,
eternally.
the Lord our God is a consuming fire,
Yeah.
and He is infinite, boundless, and unchanging in His holy opposition to all iniquity.
Yeah.
What we should say changes, though, and this is actually how I think we should read the text of Scripture, is that while we say that God does not change, we should say that the
Yeah.
manifestations of God toward us, that is to say, manifestations of His favor, manifestations of His holy opposition to sin, those are in fact mutable. So
Mm-hmm.
what I want to say is, while God doesn't change, the showings of God change,
Yeah.
and those showings are relative to the conditions
Mm-hmm.
of angels and humans.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's not because that was my second point is that the temporal order reflects, I think, a logical order, meaning if God parted the Red Sea when Moses was a baby, is completely useless. He has to part the Red Sea when the Egyptian army is bearing down on the Israelites.
Right.
So there's a logical order there also, which is itself changeless in the sense that
Yeah.
God can't reorder it so that the parting of the Red Sea is helpful when Moses is a baby. And so that's not something that changes in God either, even though temporally we experience it that way.
And even with regard to the act, the act of parting the Red Sea, in so much as it is in so much as the act is in the agent, that is God, it's an eternal action.
Yeah. Yeah.
Insofar as it terminates in the world, it takes place in a certain
That's
time
right.
relevant to a certain circumstance.
And that
And
gets
I
really
think we have to draw
powerful.
that distinction.
That's right. And it gets really powerful when you start thinking about the cross then and the eternal Son of God dying on the cross. Some of the implications of that with what you just said. So yeah, so I think that there's answers to those that help us with this reformed doctrine that God is revealing his glory to us. And his glory includes all the kinds of things that the shorter catechism names in God. All those things are knowable to us. But the last point I want to bring up with you is is that sometimes some of these views of God, I'll distinguish the Platonic and the Aristotelian, but I'll broadly call them both mystical. And that at the end of the day, they share a similar problem that I think the Christian solves, but it would worry me if we go too heavily back to either one of them. So, for example, in Plato's view, the highest vision of being takes part away from creation. You're in a cave, the world, your senses, and it's only when your body, your soul is freed from the body that you can then have this highest vision of reality, a mystical vision. And so I think Charles Hodge is right in critiquing this view, and that this isn't the Christian view of the afterlife. But sometimes when I hear the beatific vision spoken of, it sounds a lot like that. And that worries me. Do you have any thoughts on
Uh,
that?
well, I concur. I concur with that. I I think sometimes when we're talking about the beatific vision, and there's a lot in the Catholic tradition about the beatific vision that I greatly appreciate. Uh, and sometimes what happens though is that resurrection is almost lost sight of.
Yeah,
It
a
becomes a
physical resurrection.
footnote.
Yeah,
You almost have to circle back around and say, I still do affirm the resurrection because I'm a
yep,
Bible believing Christian. Even though the whole description of the Beatitude is almost sounds like Socrates' soul returning to the world of the forms.
mhm.
Because, and I, in
Yeah. That's
some
what we're.
respect, obviously, we're not returning to that world. We didn't fall from that world. We're not,
Yeah,
souls trapped in a prison house, having fallen from a world of
yeah.
forms
Well,
yet.
that's what Plato teaches in the Republic, and a lot of Christians think, wow, that's the pinnacle of philosophy. And as a philosopher, I want to say, guys, no, Plato. The critique of Plato I would give is not from the Bible. I think Plato was mistaken about general revelation.
Well, and interestingly, though he doesn't have a doctrine of creation, Aristotle, his student of 20 years, does start to see some of the problems in
Yep.
Plato's transcendence, which is interesting. Plato's philosophy is more transcendent than Aristotle's
Yep.
is, and I think Christians rightly gravitate to that transcendent
Yep.
aspect, but it's missing, now I can't remember the word. I think it's something like chorismos, or something like that. It's missing the bond, the thing that actually relates the good of
Yeah.
Plato to the material world is it's not really he's not really an explanation for
Yeah.
why there's a visible material world as
Yeah.
opposed to
It
not.
just it well, it's
And
eternal. It's co-eternal, meaning it had no beginning, and the
yes,
Debier
right.
fashions it into things that look like the forms. But yeah, that's not God. I mean, what I like to argue is that the Westminster Shorter Catechism's question definition of God, we could know that from general revelation also. So it's not really the Bible versus philosophers. It's it's mistaken views of God versus the correct view of God.
That's right. And between, among the philosophers, among the Greeks, like Christians have always recognized that some were closer to the truth of things just by natural contemplation than others. Plato and Aristotle, whose gods weren't material, is light years closer to reality, as a kind of natural contemplation than the pre-Socratic forebears.
Yeah,
But
just
then
water.
even yeah, it's not
Thales,
water,
right?
it's not thales, it's not water, uh, and yet also neither of their gods is a creator sustainer, and neither of their gods is the immediate cause from whom and through whom and to whom are all things.
Yeah,
And for neither of their gods would you say in him we live, move, and have our being. There's an
right.
immediateness in the Christian doctrine of creation. The biblical doctrine of creation offers an immediateness of causal presence that actually creates the ground
Yeah,
for closeness and communion. And even, Plato wanted participation in the forms, but
yeah,
the immediateness of the Christian doctrine of creation actually provides a groundwork for that participation that is far more profound.
right. Yeah, and I think so. And I think as Christians, we're very careful, and we should be to protect the need for Scripture. I think the Westminster Confession does it really well in chapter one, part one, but it does affirm there is natural theology. Some things are known about God, and I don't want to concede as a philosopher that these philosophers got God right. They just need the Bible. I want to say no. I don't think they even got God right with the tools they had available, which is why they're inexcusable and they're also sinners who need redemption. So something that worries me about that the God of the philosophers, God of the Bible critique is just I think the God of the Bible guys are giving up way too much to the philosophers and saying, yeah, they basically got God right as much as they could, and they just need the Bible. I'm saying, no, I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how I would say it. I would say they certainly are closer to the truth about God than someone like Thales was.
Mhm.
Um, and so I want to see that as
Yeah, you could.
somewhat you know,
This is what I
that they
appreciate
know
about
God
about
truly
Hodge.
somehow.
Yeah, I
but
mean,
not
so maybe
saving.
like they have like I use arguments from Aristotle. He actually gave what I think is the first transcendental argument for the law of non-contradiction. So the Van Tillians, I point out, hey, you guys must love Aristotle, um, but I think once we put it into systems, and that's one thing I like about Charles Hodge's systematic theology is he goes through and looks at the alternative systems, the competing systems with the biblical worldview. Platonism's a system and Aristotelianism's a system. And so they may have, you might find arguments in there, say, hey, this is good. But the system itself, neither one of those are theistic, as you already very well pointed out.
And I think you could find something like the synthesis that's in Thomas Aquinas, in which he's happy to take the bits that to him seem reasonable and true and convincing, uh, and and leave the other, and he'll take bits of Aristotle, lots of bits of Aristotle, but also bits of Plato, and then he's going to bring that together with a biblical doctrine of creation that's going to sort of reconfigure so much of that without losing what was formally true in it.
I've
But
seen the numbers
again, that
before. Is it right? He quote. It seems like he quotes Dionysius, the pseudo Dionysius, the most, and then Aristotle, then Plato.
as a philosopher, yeah, that seems about accurate. Although I want to say maybe it's Aristotle most. When it comes to church fathers, of course, it's Augustine for him.
Yeah. Yep.
Uh, Similar to Calvin, interestingly, on that point.
Yeah.
But I think it's something. Well, I think what we need to be careful of, though, and this is to Thomas's credit, is he doesn't look at an historic pagan system, if they indeed were systems, and say, I've got to sign up for one of these.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
uh, I think he's very emphatic that again, fighting against the Latin avarice at the Sorbonne. If you remember this debate, they were basically saying Aristotle is philosophy and philosophy
Yeah.
is Aristotle.
Yeah.
I always find it interesting that Aquinas is critiqued by some Protestants as being basically trying to reinterpret the whole Bible through Aristotle,
Yeah.
when it was actually Aquinas who was fighting the Aristotelians at the Sorbonne, saying
Yeah.
that Aristotle isn't, in fact, the definition of good philosophy.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point because that's kind of what I was saying a moment ago. To say, don't identify philosophy with Plato and Aristotle. Um, we should have a Christian philosophy which studies general revelation and shows that what you and I have been talking about the doctrine of God. We can those are things we should know about God, and because of unbelief, we need redemption, which is what's explained in Scripture.
I'm going to circle really quick back to something you brought up a few minutes ago about, well, if I just have my Bible, why do I need this? And
Yeah,
I guess what I want to say is, in one respect, it's kind of like the word Trinity. You don't have to have heard Trinitas to be a Trinitarian. You just need to believe that there's one God, not three, that these three are really distinct and yet they're the self same God and that they're co-equal. If you believe that based on Scripture, then you're basically Nicene,
yeah,
without any of the sort of nicknames and formulations. So the formulations will help and bolster and strengthen and protect that conviction, but they're not indispensable to that conviction.
yeah,
I would say the same thing with regard to divine simplicity. If you believe that there's nothing in God that is not God, upon which God depends to be God, then you're already on board. Like
yeah,
you're already an adherent to divine simplicity, and all this is really just a formal apparatus designed to protect that core Christian biblical conviction from all those subtle, sinister ways that the human mind might chip away at it.
yeah. That's good.
That's how I
One,
would, and like I said, then the philosophical theology actually helps us,
yeah,
but I don't want to say it's indispensable to the core conviction itself.
yeah. I like that a lot. It's a good description, and you brought up the Trinity. That was also an important discussion this year at the ETS, where I think we had a discussion there, but between a classical Trinitarian, a Apollinarian, and a Unitarian. What's the importance of divine simplicity to understanding the Trinity correctly?
Sometimes it comes off like simplicity, all that is in God is God, and especially the identity account of simplicity, that the attributes in God are all really identical with each other. Immediately it raises the suspicion in the modern mind that that might tend towards something like modalism, where there's no real distinction of persons in God, and so you will lose Trinity.
Is that part
And
of, I mean, I think maybe Frame and Poythress are worried about that.
uh, Yeah, I think they are somewhat. Poitras, at least, I don't know Frame's exact
Okay.
concern of it. I think Poitras does have that concern. But I think this is, maybe just put this, just kind of flip it around for a second and say, I don't think that anyone, like, say, in the fourth century, would have thought that you could have articulated a doctrine of the Trinity without commitment to divine simplicity.
Yeah.
Because without commitment to divine simplicity, at least the core commitment of it, if not the technical apparatus and language, without commitment to divine simplicity, you actually don't have any solid reason to avoid tripartitism or tritheism.
Yeah.
In other
That's
words,
right.
there are three God bits. If you mix them together as parts, God is actually the consequent of a sort of group. So it becomes sort of like God incorporated.
Yeah, I think that's
You
the
get
worry with how William Lane Craig's articulating it, right?
I was going to say that that is the Moreland Craig volume on philosophical theology. That is exactly. I mean, they're very explicit. The persons relate to the whole as parts. They're emphatic. That's almost a verbatim quote. So I think that's one worry. Now you have something in God more fundamental than God, namely the persons themselves, who
Mhm.
become, and so then God becomes a corporation term that is in fact the consequent of something more basic than itself. And then there
Yeah.
is something in God more basic than God, namely the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that's the one concern. Like, God isn't absolutely irreducible anymore
Yeah.
in that conception. The other one is, and I think this is actually related, is social Trinitarianism, which is practically tritheism in so many expressions of it,
Yeah.
where so that would be my concern, Owen, is that without divine simplicity, why couldn't you just reimagine all the data into some kind of exotic group thing?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, and it seems I think you're right about the heart of the Trinity is in this doctrine because the three persons are God, not
right.
add up to God.
Yeah,
And
that's right. It's
so
not
when
one
you
plus one plus one.
yeah, and that's why I think the Shorter Catechism puts what is God first in question 4, because then when you say, well, and the Holy Spirit's God, you mean that the Holy Spirit's infinite, eternal, unchanging, etc.
But that's actually the thing. I think William Lane Craig is really wary of saying something like the Holy Spirit is God, what you just said, or the Son is God, because he thinks they're parts of God,
Mm-hmm.
and parts aren't. And he's right about this, that parts aren't equal to
Yeah,
wholes, aren't identical with wholes. Then you can call them divine. That is
yeah,
to say, they contribute to godness, but you couldn't just call the Son. You couldn't say, in the classic sense, the Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit
yeah,
is God. You would have to kind of soften that and say the Father is divine, the Son's divine, the
yeah.
Spirit is divine, and together you get God as a consequent of those
They
three coming being
participate
together.
in divineness or something. I think that's.
Yeah,
I mean, it sounds to me like these are the Trinitarian or the heresies that the Trinitarians were arguing against in the time of Nicaea, right?
yeah, that's I think that's not an exaggeration. There's a statement from Edward Fazer, I think in his book on 5 proofs for God's existence, where he says that without divine simplicity, you have atheism.
Mm,
And he's
wow.
just kind of classic Fazer, just say it
Mm-hmm.
bluntly, and then he builds out his arguments for it. But I think
Yeah,
he's onto something with that, which is to say, without divine simplicity, you actually don't have a first cause of being.
yeah.
And so you might have something that you call God, which is really, really, really
Very
great
powerful. Yeah,
and powerful and wise, maybe even loving, just, and kind, but not the one from whom and through whom or to whom are all things. And so
yeah,
what you've really done is you've traded real theism for, in his, for an alien from Alpha Centauri, maybe,
yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, you're basically just saying Yahweh is more powerful than Zeus, but along the
It
same
becomes
lines.
so in the confession, we say that God is most absolute.
Yeah,
Whereas you couldn't say most absolute, you could just say relatively more absolute. But in
yeah,
so much as that thing you call God is reducible to principles, parts which are causes, then it couldn't be most absolute.
yeah, yeah. That's right. So, and I think kind of wrapping up here with the idea that divine simplicity must lead to a kind of otherworldly mysticism it seems like we can use the reformed insight that we know God as he's revealed himself to us. And the first question, the Shorter Catechism, that our chief end is to glorify God, enjoy him forever, that God's revealing himself to us in the many different truths of creation and providence and redemption. And it's knowing those things that is our chief end, our greatest joy. And that includes the fact that we have bodies, we'll be raised from the dead. So it's not at all like what the mystics taught or continue to teach.
I'm okay with a little bit of mysticism in it, but I don't want to just leave my body behind,
Yeah.
and then just sort of like in an appendix say, "Oh yeah, the body will be there,"
Yeah. Not
sort of
sure what to do with it
inconvenient.
though.
Not sure what it's doing there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Why it's there.
I mean, I would want to see, at least as I conceive it now, the beatific vision as being somewhat twofold. That with the eyes of my heart, I will, in some extraordinary way that I cannot describe in this life, behold the triune God, not as a body with a surface seen by
Yeah.
eyes in my head,
Yeah.
but with my heart. But I think that corresponding to that and really inseparable from that, in terms of my redemption, will be the resurrection of my body, in
Yeah.
which I will literally look on the resurrected body of Christ Jesus and
Yeah.
fall down in adoration and worship.
Yeah. That's right. Um, yeah. So the heart, the seeing with your heart, do you take that to be different than the outcome of being sanctified through the truth? Like, are these truths that you'll know about God,
I
or is it
don't
more of a
know of them.
feeling?
I think, well, I don't think it's going to be like acing a theology exam or something. But I think the beatific vision is going to be, there's going to be something superlative in the way of knowing that's more than mastery of bits of revelation.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I would agree with
and
that. I
I
mean,
guess that's why I said I'm a somewhat okay with the mystical, in that's that limit that I'm not able to say.
yeah, well, that's a good point. Like, what's our limit and what we can articulate? But I think the idea that it's just a purely intellectual exercise where you kind of write down stuff probably misses the way the word know is used relationally. To know
I agree.
God is not just like, I can write down the Westminster Shorter Catechism answers, but it is still a process of knowing, even relationally, um, that we have. So yeah, but I think you're right. There might be
Because
some limits.
I think you're right to not just reduce it to like the summit of cognition or something like that,
Yeah.
for humans. I agree with Aristotle that all men by nature desire to know, no matter
Mhm.
how much some make us doubt that. I believe that is fundamentally right, and yet at the same time, I don't. I think that the beatific vision is actually getting at something more. It's getting at something that is in fact personal and communal,
Yeah.
uh, that has this, to know God and enjoy Him forever, and this joy component of
Yep.
beatitude
Yep.
that goes with the knowing Him, I think raises it above just sort of like the satisfaction of some Aristotelian rule or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah, 100%. So that's great. So hey, I want to thank you for your time today, and working through what you and I probably think are really fun things to work through, somewhat technical, but also I think really helpful for the Christian life. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. I enjoyed it.